full? Maybe. I think Margaret is joining us, right? Also as our, yeah. As our district subject matter expert. Just one moment. Thank you, Natasha. I saw you said that right after I did. Doing a little text like, wait, where's Margaret? Anyway, well, let's, while we're waiting for Margaret to join us, we want to talk about, in a general sense, the program impacts and what this means. So the approaches that were described. There's Margaret. Hello. The two approaches that were described, in Proposal A, it prioritizes the positioning of DLI programs close to where native speakers live, as opposed to Proposal B, where the goal is to try to keep the programs in close proximity to where they currently are. And then, of course, the resulting impacts to the location of CSS. So we are going to, as was mentioned previously, we're going to talk about each scenario individually in our next breakouts, but in a general sense, how do you feel about this approach? What are the key differences, and what are your thoughts and concerns?
Well, I just want to say that I still feel like I have not heard any rationale around why CSS is maintaining its K-8 model in a neighborhood program when we have done this entire process to increase access to comprehensive middle schools. And now we're saying that either Arleta or Woodstock neighborhood students would have to opt out of their community neighborhood school assignment if they wanted to actually access that middle school that we've been working towards. I haven't heard any reason why that's happening.
Yeah, and the reason given was more procedural, right, related to the board of the school board. I don't, Margaret, do you want to talk about that a little bit?
That wasn't clear to me.
So when we're looking at programs, Beth, can you restate your question? Is the question why maintain a K-8 program? Or is the question the neighborhood part of the K-8?
Yeah, well, it's both. It's why is CSS's K-8 configuration taking precedence over a community neighborhood school assignment to a middle school? I understand, like with Winter Haven, for example, every student there has made a decision to lottery into this program and sort of give up that access to a comprehensive middle school in favor of that. That's not what's happening here. These are families who are assigned to this school. And then if they want the middle school that we've been telling them, and in Arleta's case, like actually assigned them to last year, that we're telling them that now they have to opt out of their neighborhood assignment in order to access that. So that's the rationale piece that I am lost on.
So it's there are two streams that are coming together, right? And so one is that when we are looking at programs that are K-8, that the configuration of creative science, in order for that configuration to be adjusted, requires a program review, which is not part of the charge of the Southeast Guiding Coalition. So that's one part of the answer. And I can see that that's unsatisfactory, Beth. So I'm going to come back and so that's one part, right? Is that, and that's by policy, right? So I can point you to a specific policy that says that if we're going to do that, it's a separate process. And that was not included. The neighborhood portion of it, as we're starting to go through and look at the variety of shifts that are happening across the system, then you have to look at, it becomes a more complex question of, as Harrison Park is moving to Clark, how do, there are these tensions between how do we have the number of buildings we have, what are the capacities, how are we going to move, like what are those pieces? And so that's part of the charge. I don't think that this is still going to be a satisfactory answer. So I think that the question about why is it not, I think your question is why is it not two. One is why does it stay K-8, which is a procedural piece, and I'll pull up the policy to share with you. And then two is I think the other part of the question is why doesn't it stay pure lottery? Is that
no, that part I understand. I mean,
okay?
I get that piece. I mean, I guess the rationale could be explained more clearly. And I think there was piece about, that does reduce the number of transfers and kids pulled out of surrounding schools. And I understand that element of it, especially if you have buildings where you could maintain that the existing students at Creative Science and not just sort of pull them out of their school experience midstream, that it sort of allows that. I mean, that piece I understand. It's the K-8 versus the K-5. We have a model with Buckman that's a K-5. I feel like there's a lot of concerns, like if students, let's say half the students at the school decide they want a middle school, do we now have enough students remaining in those 6th through 8th grades at that neighborhood school to have a viable program? Or are we going to be adding to that lottery at that point and pulling kids out of Lane and Harrison Park that we've just been struggling to reach and, it's like, I don't, so.
Has that happened yet? Like CSS has been a school for 35 years. Have they pulled from other middle schools because of low enrollment ever?
Yeah, they have a huge number from Roseway Heights and the K-8 programs at Harrison Park currently.
Sure, yeah, but those are full lottery in, right? That's full opt-in, and they want to stay K through 8. Like they stay through 8th grade, or they opt out at 6th grade and go to their middle school.
Right, but I'm saying if enough people opt out, you're going to have to open up spots at that point.
And what I'm saying is that's pure speculation, right? Maybe what happens if everybody opts out? Well, then I think we have to deal with that when it happens, but you can't plan for that.
Yeah, well, you can talk to the Arletta families or the Woodstock families and say, how many of you actually want a K-8 again? Or how many of you just want a middle school?
I feel strongly for those families. I don't like that there's anybody being displaced. I don't think it's great that we're just converting them to neighborhood and now you have to go here. I don't think that's a perfect scenario either. I don't think that the K-8 model is probably what we need to focus in on this piece. It's a constructivist from beginning to end program is why it's part of the entire program and doesn't split up. But I don't know if that helps answer anything, but that's kind of what's part of the program. It's more than just policy of making it K-5 and cutting off 6 to 8, putting a different building. There's a whole program as part of the learning path through there.
So I guess my question is, if it's procedural and there would need to be an assessment, why wasn't that included? Why not go down the road for everybody so that it could seem like it's a fair shot for everybody who could possibly be impacted? Because right now, I hear what you're saying, Josh, about creative sciences. But the bigger point is it doesn't seem fair that they're protected and these other schools aren't, because whatever their education model is, it's just as important to those families who have kids who are thriving in that space as it is to parents of creative science. So it feels like this was a loophole. I mean, and this is just as a parent, probably at Arleta or wherever else who is going to be impacted by this. It's a loophole to get that group of families and parents who would, raise Cain protected, whereas the people who may not raise Cain aren't protected. And so my question is just simply, why didn't we include that? Because then this wouldn't be an issue. Then it would have been incorporated. The decisions would be made seemingly more equitably, more in consideration of everybody who's impacted, not just the people who are not seeming to get preference.
Yeah. And Adriel, thank you very much. I mean, that's an important question to raise. And I will probably pass this to Margaret, but my understanding of Margaret, correct me if I'm wrong, is that it wasn't part of the program review. It wasn't something that was anticipated early enough that it was part of the charge. And it's a time issue now. Is that right?
I would say that's on PPS, right? Because this has been this focus option review has been on the table since what, 2012, 2013, and they've just been not doing it. And so that's where we are with the review piece there. So it wasn't even that it wasn't time for phase 1 or phase 2. It's that it's been years out of date. So I do agree that that should be done, and that should be, sorry, I didn't mean to talk over.
No.
Sarah, I meant you had your hand up.
Oh, yeah.
Please.
Oh, I'm fine to wait while you talk.
No.
Yeah, so just to kind of piggyback on what's being said about the CSS reasoning being, it has to say a K through 8 for now, because what that document said, it wasn't feasible to do a full program evaluation, right? Well, so if we take that reasoning, shouldn't we also be applying that reasoning to Woodstock and Arleta? So with Arleta, where will the district be fitting in the time to do a full program evaluation on transitioning it from a K-8 to a K-5, and what the impacts are, transitioning it into essentially a focus option school and turning it back into a K-8? Where's the time for the study on that?
Yeah, it's a good question.
And
So I want to make sure people have a chance to ask questions, and I'm writing them down. I'm happy to provide a little context, but I'm just kind of tracking these, and I also am going to be cognizant of time. So I want to make sure. Thank you, Sarah, for that. Are there any other questions that people have? And Adriel and Josh and Beth for posing questions. So are there any other specific questions people have? And then we can kind of circle back. But I am recording sort of what the questions are at this point in time.
I have a question. How are we being sure that we are hearing the voices of Native speakers at Lent in Harrison Park, just as much as we're hearing the voices of the Native speakers at Woodstock and Atkinson? Because we need to be, I would say, even prioritizing the voices of the Native speakers at the lower SES schools, because they are the communities that are even more historically underserved. And they might not have the resources to organize. And I'm wondering what we're doing to be sure that we are hearing those voices.
Yeah, and they weren't captured much during the listening and learning sessions.
Right, because they're not going to have the time or the resources to show up for those meetings and speak for their community.
No, that's an important point. Thinking about who we are not hearing from.
It seems like we also gathered together kind of what all of those opinions might be and put them under non-negotiables.
Limiting their ability to be able to enact change, even when we do talk to them meeting. Is that
right? I mean, if we were to bring in, Native speakers and talk to them about this whole school DLI program, and they say that's the dumbest thing I don't want to do that, like they did in phase 1, it's a non-negotiable. So it's happening anyway. So,
we're curtailing their ability to be able to really comment on what's happening. Yeah.
Rather than increase our outreach to talk to more people, we just decided, well, we're going to prescribe this instead.
Dee, oh shoot. I wanted to make sure we heard from everybody. I was going to circle back to Dee. So maybe when we come back in the next time.
Okay, welcome back, everyone. First off, is everyone able to get into the Miro board successfully? We have a lot of content here. I just want to make sure everyone's able to access that. I can also share my screen if that's easier. Though if you're in Miro, it gives you a lot more flexibility of being able to, to really zoom in on information. So everyone good? Okay, so as was discussed, we're going to do kind of a deep dive into Proposal A. So just as a reminder, Proposal A is about a regional whole school DLI approach. The goal is to prioritize DLI programs closest to native speakers. And then there's the resulting impacts to CSS being relocated to Woodstock. So let's talk about this. Let's talk about pros and cons, thinking about your school community as well as other school communities with a special focus on impacts to BIPOC students.
I guess one question I kind of have, and maybe this is more specific than we're meaning to be right now, but so, we just opened Kellogg and it has the Spanish DLI and, kids coming from Lint and, all these different places to go to DLI Spanish at Kellogg. So if this change happens, are we somehow logistically granting these Spanish DLI students the ability to stay at Kellogg, like we often grant English-speaking students the ability to finish out at the school they started at? Or are they all going to deal with being put into this brand new shiny program that was built for them at the school they're attending now? And then they're going to be pulled and put into a program at another location? Just logistically speaking.
Phased kind of implementation, like
right.
And an option to stay where they are and finish out their program.
Right.
It's a good question.
Because it seems like an awfully tricky thing to consider trying to maintain finishing off a DLI program in a location for the benefit of those students. So I'm perhaps being a little bit of a negative Nancy and assuming that PPS is not planning on doing that. But I'm curious whether that's been considered for those students who are exactly the students we're talking about doing better for. So
with the goal to minimize disruption too, which that could be
right.
I don't know, Margaret, from a policy perspective, or Rachel from a modeling perspective, has that been talked about at all?
From the modeling perspective, we're primarily looking at the long-term impacts of these changes. So I'll have to defer either to Margaret or someone else from the district on that implementation of it.
So I think that as we're, I'm flipping through to see if there's specific language around the implementation of various pieces. I think that again, I hear the question, Sarah, about like what is, so one of the tensions is like, what is the impact next year, right? And then like, what are we looking at long term? And this is one of those pieces like of how do we hold both at the same time? So I hear the question, I'll see if there's a specific, if there's something specific that I can point to. But again, I think that part of the challenge is looking to, and I hear the statement primarily being, so I heard this with in both spaces around Arleta and around Kellogg is, so we just did something, are we going to shift it immediately? Like, and that's a concern. So I'll circle back in a minute. Just give me a second on one piece, but I think again, some of it is short term, and then how does that play out in long term? And so I think that's one of the kind of things I want us to think through.
Thank you. No, really important question though. There's so many things to think about, right? Like around the implementation of this, and yeah. Other thoughts?
I'm really struggling on, this is a hard way for me to do this, and like knowing that we're in such a limited time. A question that I have about this scenario is there are 2 DLI programs proposed at Harrison Park. And I want to know about, so the pros and cons kind of on that, like having the Spanish DLI program split between 2 middle schools, as opposed to having them all in one, having 2 separate DLI programs in one middle school, as opposed to supporting only one DLI. So sort of those pieces around what are the pros and cons of how DLI is situated within middle schools is something that, for the comparison between the 2 scenarios, that I feel like I need a better understanding of.
Rachel, do you, would there be information on the dashboard that would be helpful in that regard?
In regards to how having multiple programs under one building impacts the experience? Is that what you're getting at, Beth?
Yeah, I feel like I would want to hear from principals and sort of on the instructional side on that, you know, in terms of how does that divide up a community, or how do students have access to electives and various things when there's multiple programs or smaller programs in a middle school building.
So
I will say that from my perspective as area senior director for middle schools, it does make it much more complicated for a school to do what they need to for students elective wise when there's more than one DLI program within a school. That doesn't mean that they can't do it, but it does become a much more complex scheduling issue to make sure that all students can access what they need to be able to access.
And I think the other piece is just the size of the programs, right? So if the 2 programs are equal size, and then that plays out in one direction, and if one program is growing and maturing, right, and another program is more established, so the size of it makes a difference, and then in comparison to you know, what happens with the and how that sits within the entire population of the school.
So I don't want to take up too much, but I want to clarify in this one. So it would be at Harrison Park would be the Bridger strand of, Spanish would be coming from Lent. All of the Spanish immersion would be at Lent to Harrison Park in this one. And the Chinese immersion would be coming from Bridger. Okay. And there would be no Spanish at Kellogg in this one?
That's correct.
Okay.
So have we thought about the rates of learning for the different programs when we move programs from two different schools? One might have a smaller class that might be accelerated in their learning. The other one might have a larger class, a little bit slower. What are we going to do about that? Or has anybody thought about that? Like when you're merging kids from 2 different programs, you're merging kids with different levels of proficiency. Right. My son came from the international school where there were 6 kids in his class to Richmond, where there were 24, and he had a lot more language skills than probably the average kindergartner, because he had a smaller group of kids he was around and a lot more attention in his Japanese at the international school. So how are we going to account for those type of challenges? I mean,
yeah. Are you thinking alignment of programs and instructional practices, or maybe providing some additional supports for students to ensure that there could be, you know, some level of differentiated instruction maybe initially, right? Like to kind of bring everybody up to the same.
I mean, I think probably both, right? Like what are the curriculum qualifiers or the efficiency goals and standards at each of those schools? Different teachers are going to teach a different way, and different kids are going to acquire information in different ways. So, I mean, on top of the fact that you're going to have kids that might have, you know, challenges with learning, maybe they're on IEPs or different things.
Yeah. And I don't think the special education impacts have been modeled yet. Is that right? That's one of the pending.
So within dual language immersion, it's expected that there's going to be a range of proficiencies, and within each grade band, there is a certain level, you know, whether it's, you know, intermediate mid or intermediate high or advanced low, what we're expecting kids to be able to have achieved by that grade band. But of course, coming into dual language immersion, you do have kids who are both native speakers of the target language and who are not native speakers. And so within that, obviously there's going to be a difference in proficiency level. We also have kids who are coming from different dialects of the target language. So for example, we have speakers of Cantonese and speakers of Mandarin, which changes proficiency already within the classrooms. So teachers are used to differentiating for a range of proficiency levels. It's built into what they're doing with the work with the 4 language domains. Does that somewhat answer the question?
I'm having internet difficulty. So yes, I didn't know if you could see me nodding, but yes, thank you.
It kind of, I'm not sure if this is the right spot for this question, but just when we were talking about the guardrails in the last slide, one sort of, like Josh brought up the point that the guardrails sort of are in exact like opposition to what a lot of the community feedback was on what they felt like their benefit was from the programs. And sort of in light of that, is the locating of the programs considered one of the guardrails? Like how much is the heat map considered to be part of the guardrail? Because I remember in the last coalition, particularly for the Chinese program, but also to a certain extent for the Spanish programs, the heat map I felt like a lot of those families felt like that heat map was almost offensive in some ways, because it made this assumption that was where they wanted the programs to be located, whereas other sort of higher SES programs like Richmond or Winter Haven or even CSS, they were choosing based on like a central location or a part of the city that was more desirable based on where they were drawing all of their families from. They weren't just distinguishing the native speaking families. So I'd be interested to hear a little bit more about whether or not how much of a guardrail that heat map is, and to understand sort of the equity piece around that as well. I think there's some, like Eddie said, there's some assumptions that people are making about motivations for immigrants that feels a lot to me like non-immigrants are making assumptions about the value and the way that immigrant populations choose their, like to shape the education for their children. So I'd like to understand a little bit about how that is, why that's being, where that came from, if that's being held as like a central piece of it.
Yeah, so the idea like that might be an assumption we're making. Is that what you're?
Yeah, I think so.
I know, and our dialogue sessions didn't have as high of a participation rate as we had hoped with everything going on, in COVID. But there we did receive feedback. I know in the dialogue sessions that was an advantage, the proximity factor, and being situated in a neighborhood, but also having the ability of like older siblings to walk younger siblings to school, things like that. So we did hear some. I think that there's a lot of layers of input, and that was one piece of it. But yeah. And I think there's pros and cons, because we also heard, the disruption of moving programs, right? In proposal or scenario B, that's a different approach based on feedback as well, right? That not wanting to have that disruption of having to relocate.
It is kind of interesting because I remember hearing feedback from and seeing some letters from the Harrison Park community where proximity really was prioritized, and the like having access to a school building that was in their community was really important. And it's interesting that Mandarin immersion program is the one that was moved in both of these scenarios. Neither one has their program remaining, but I do feel like I heard that feedback from folks in that community.
Yes, that's true.
So I think that part of the, as we go through, part of the tensions or the complexity as we look is, that there are numerous things. Like, so we also heard statements, and we've referenced this a couple of times about location and program. Like, this shows up in a bunch of different ways and how people are approaching and talking about it. And I think that one of the things that you know, it may be interesting to unpack, and to your point, Dee, like, can we go in and get deeper into some of what this means and unpacking it? But, you know, this part about that our Black, Indigenous, and people of color shouldn't sacrifice program opportunities because of where they live, right? So, like, what does that mean exactly is like an interesting question. Like, it shouldn't be bait. So trying to unpack that a little bit more, I think is worth exploring.
Yeah, and that BIPOC communities and marginalized communities, that transportation presents a more significant barrier than white communities. And so, like, just, you know, ensuring that barrier wasn't keeping them from having an equitable educational experience.
I just feel like it's something that has to be explored a little bit more, because so much of the sentiment from the Latinx community was just, you know, it's like this idea of sort of like separate but equal, and like just everything, you know, part of sort of like, I think what people are feeling like the inherent racism in the process is that there's all these very like, this is true and this is true and this is true. There's all these like statistics and these like study, you know, you guys are kind of laying out all of these very like, they're like, it's like an equation, you know, it's like an equation. Your variables are all very accurate and very like, they're hard to argue with, I guess, if that makes sense. But like convincing these communities that have been marginalized that they are going to get the same level of services that they're seeing families get in other communities that are wealthier. I just think it's hard to get people to believe that. And I felt like that was a lot of the basis of the feedback that we saw in the previous rounds, was that it seemed like, at least from the surface, it feels like while it all makes sense, a lot of the higher SES programs are being preserved intact where they are, per the request of the community, even when, it's like you're applying these values variably between the different communities and the different programs. And I think it just makes it hard to, sort of like accept all the data, I guess, if that makes sense, because there's all these exceptions carved out throughout the district for these other programs that, like, for whatever reason, they're high quality, or they have a very special way that they need to function that require them to be outliers to sort of like these rules that are being laid out. And so it's just trying to understand how you communicate that to the community in a way that doesn't just feel like it's segregation. You know, we talked a lot about what that word meant, and I don't sort of disagree that it's been misused to some extent, but it is, I just think it's something, I don't know if that was clear enough, but it's hard to look around at the other programs within the district and see how overcrowding is persisting with some middle schools, and some programs are staying as a K-8. Like, why is a DLI 6 through 8? Is there not any program integrity that you would consider that needs to be preserved, that means that DLI programs should also stay at K through 8? I just feel like there has to be more transparency in how these baselines are being laid.
Can everybody hear me now? Oh, that was weird. Yeah, it was like saying my microphone wasn't working for some reason, but okay. Welcome back. So we're on to proposal B, submitting process. And then just as a reminder, under this proposal, the goal is to keep the DLI programs closer to where they are currently located, minimizing the disruption to students. And then CSS would relocate to Arleta. Beth, oh, sorry. You froze for me, Beth. Is Beth froze?
Froze, Beth. Oh, sorry. The concerns from DLI programs that I've been hearing about about segregation to the outskirts of the city have seemed to be more focused on proposal A, and I'm wondering if those same concerns apply here.
No, that's interesting. And Dee, you had raised questions about that in the first, or actually the second breakout. What are your thoughts on that? I mean, do you have the same concerns with proposal B, or do you think that that's a better approach?
I think the concern with either proposal is just the consolidation of the Spanish, really any of the DLIs in the Lentz location or the Harrison Park location, because both of those communities expressed that they felt like those are marginalized locations. And so that's why I was asking about the heat map, to sort of how the heat map factored in, because I think there's ways that you can ask questions to people. And so if I know one of the questions that Richard had brought up, or the former principal at Lentz, was that they have a hard time enrolling the non-native speaking program at Lentz. So in terms of trying to grow it. And so I don't know if taking a survey where you're asking native speakers who aren't enrolled in the program because there isn't room, because there aren't enough non-native speakers, would you be interested in this program if it was available closer to your house? That to me isn't a complete question, if that makes sense. It's like, what are these families looking for? I think that Eddie is articulating it really well for his community, but what are these communities looking for in the experience? Is, if you ask somebody, if I could have this and it was closer to me, I would say yes, but I wouldn't necessarily understand sort of what the trade-offs are to that. Whereas if we could enroll a program more robustly in a different location, even if, let's say, the Spanish was at Arleta, we just picking a building that can fit 4 strands. If it was fully enrolled at 4 strands because there was equal buy-in from both portions of the program, is that a healthier program? Are there more spots of, if it's a choice of there's 10 spots available if there's Lentz because we can't enroll the neighborhood at Lentz, or if there's 40 spots available if it's someplace more central because we can enroll it. I just think there's got to be more qualification to the question, because you're asking these marginalized communities this question with an expectation that they have all of this background about why these programs are where they are and what the availability and the access is going to be. And so that's the part, I guess that's the piece, if that answers the question, is that it's not, I don't even know that it's a question of either of those locations being, I think that maybe some communities are going to look up a school rating and it'll affect their decision on whether or not they apply to that program or not. And some communities aren't going to do that. They're going to choose proximity because that's their only choice, is that they don't have sort of the bandwidth to go past that first layer of how do my kids get to school safely in a way that facilitates our family and our lifestyle. So you're dealing with these like really different motivations when you're trying to enroll the programs. And I just would like to see that as part of the equation, because I think that's really the concern that our, in our Bridger community, when we had our sort of like PTA sponsored feedback, a lot of the families were really concerned because they had been hearing from the non-native families that it wasn't feasible for them to take their kids to a different location because they were already coming from other parts of the city. And so the concern is that the portion of the existing program would become under enrolled and that the community wouldn't be able to move together. And so I think that, the Woodstock community had said that they really liked their current location, both at Woodstock and Hosford and Cleveland, because it was just central for everybody that was trying to get there. And it didn't seem to be affecting their enrollment. And it's a hard problem for PPS to solve, because you do need the proximity to reach sort of like the most in need families does require that proximity. But the program itself for robust enrollment requires buy-in from more than one community. And it's like, I just want to make sure that we're not sort of like taking the academic track of like, let's put the program closer and then not being able to enroll it, if that makes sense. Because the reality is that the non-native speaking families are looking at proximity, school rankings, all of those things. And so I just don't want that piece of concern from the previous session to get lost, I guess, in this.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So let's think about how it's impacting your individual school communities as well as the wider assortment of the 21 schools or 20 schools.
I would maybe just chime in quickly for Bridger. It would be my feeling based on the feedback that we've gotten that the program would move with a lot of integrity in the upper grades because there's a lot of community established already in those grades, and the kids are pretty, the kids and the families are pretty entrenched in that program. And so in like the third, fourth, fifth grade, I think you'll see some good fidelity of the program moving. I feel like in the younger grades that it's going to really destabilize that program for a long time because a lot of, especially during COVID and with all the challenges, I think a lot of families might need to choose to withdraw from the program if the location doesn't work, and so they're having to like rebuild a program, if that makes sense. And I do feel like the middle school assignment is something that families take into account when they look at these programs, and it just, it will take Harrison Park a while to get up and established. And so I'm not sure what the solution is for any of this. And I'm not sure which programs, I mean, has there been a discussion within PPS about sort of the real time feasibility of what programs could be moved sort of with the most fidelity and which programs will see a lot of attrition with the move?
I think that's a complex answer to your point, Dee. Like, I think it's, I think that is what are the assumptions, I think, about how people are going to respond in the future is challenging. I think that's a challenging, it's just challenging. So I think to your point, like what I think the question is, what are the key pieces and or considerations and or communication strategies or engagement with the community do we need to have to for there to be programs moving with robustness and fidelity as you're describing, right? So like I think it's more of a question of like what do we anticipate? So you're articulating some of the potential barriers, and so the question is how do we mitigate those potential barriers? I think is part of the question.
And I guess at the end of the day, I know that there's a lot of focus on like the immediate transition, but there's so much to take into consideration that I just would hate for a lot of focus on the immediate transition to affect establishing programs that have like long-term health and viability, if that makes sense. And so just sort of really considering in these like the shuffle last year at the end of the year for Creston, it feels like in the initial feedback from our community that basically the board replaced the Spanish program with Creston. And after all of the work that we did in phase 1 about why that was a good location from an equity standpoint and accessibility standpoint, why Kellogg was a good, we really prioritized the DLI being in Kellogg. It was one of the sort of like things that didn't change throughout the whole initial process. And to have it be displaced by the board after all of that sort of equity and SES work at the beginning, I think feels really frustrating. And so it just would be nice to not have a repeat. I'm already hearing like, well, let's just do this and then we'll see what happens and then we'll do it again. And I just don't think it's fair to be moving a community that already struggles to get a foothold to not give it a place that is permanent with intention, I guess, if that makes sense.
How about others? Haven't heard from, let's see, Sarah or Josh in a bit.
Ellie has her hand up as well. Sorry.
No, whoever has their hand up, go.
Oh, you're on mute.
Draft B, proposal B would really drastically change the demographic for Marysville School. And we would likely lose our Title I funding quite rapidly. And that would really, really change things for us. We don't have an affluent community in any way. We are a low SES school. And our Title I funding is $170,000 that we would lose. And we don't even have a PTA. So I would just urge it to be considered how we would be impacted so quickly. Yeah. and possibly other low SES schools as well, whose demographic would quickly change.
No, that's a really important point. Thank you. Anyone else?
I would just say to what Ellie just said, that is a big deal. Losing Title I is huge. And when it suddenly happens, because our LEDA just went through that in the last few years, that immense drop off in funding, and it's a big deal. And it's really a struggle for these neighborhood community schools in this zone. It's a really hard thing to go through. So yeah, I would hope that that would be taken into account, the impact that would have on the Marysville community. And then just, I don't know, our LEDA is currently really underrepresented here because their principal is out. They've just got Sandra because I moved up to being Kellogg. So I would just like to speak really briefly to our LEDA because I feel like there's still so many unknowns with Kellogg and the Spanish DLI. I'm not even really sure how to approach that, and Dee covers it so well. But in terms of our LEDA, I would say this is a massive, massive shock to that community. Just even this idea was not even on anyone's radar that this could possibly happen. And it makes me very, very concerned about PPS and what is said about outreach and talking to communities and what actually happens. And if you don't want everyone to be super upset, you have to talk to them. And I'd be curious, like with Josh and CSS, like, were they spoken to? Did they have any idea these ideas were coming down the pipeline this week? Because I know our LEDA didn't, and it's pretty shocking. So
I'm on behalf of our LEDA too, I would just say, I would like to understand, I mean, there's Bridger, Lentz, Marysville, Arleta, and Creston in this equation. And I think we all understood at the end of the last term that one of those schools had, just because of the enrollment issues and the under enrollment, that there was going to be some consolidation, but it would be nice to see some transparency about why Arleta was picked. I mean, you know, as much as it pains me to say it, if I was looking at it as an analyst, I wonder why Bridger wasn't picked, because it's a small school. It really should only be populated with 2 strands. There's a history with CSS at Bridger already. There would just be nice to have some like transparent, you know, Creston's also a small school. It's the size is better suited for the program, for the CSS program, if they were going to become a non-neighborhood based option. So I think, I don't know, Josh, do you guys feel like you would like to have a little bit more input or clarity on sort of like what the nature is of the building? I feel like you guys have been really gracious in feeling like, we get it, we're not a neighborhood program, we should just take what we should get. But it would also be nice to hear from you guys about what would be ideal, about what works. If we're trying to solve multiple problems here, I think it's important to figure that out. And then whatever school is displaced, the transparency would just feel better, that there was a reason and a logic that went behind it that was, again, being like equally applied through the whole process.
Yeah, I mean, to answer a couple of those questions, I would say no, there was no, the Arleta Woodstock thing was a complete surprise, kind of, I think, to everybody when we started that meeting, right, on Thursday. That's when we all saw it for the first time. And same with our community there. And we've done some outreach just to say, you know, here's something that is happening. Our community has tried to be very, you know, forthcoming in the fact that we know we didn't paint ourselves into this corner, but we're here and we want to be able to help and to be able to increase diversity in our own school, as well as help all the schools around us and not stand in the way of progress. So everyone's really tried hard to kind of stay along that route. But again, you know, I think if we were able to tell the story of we are consolidating these schools to benefit these students, which then frees up a building for CSS, that story comes along better than CSS is going to displace this community or this community. If consolidation, you know, is piece of that, then we should lead with that. But
We're down to our last couple minutes here. Any other thoughts?
Is Hassan a parent or a teacher? Or I feel like we haven't heard from.
Hassan's an area senior. Oh, sorry, Hassan.
Yeah. Hi. No, sorry. I'm one of the ASDs, so I'm trying to be here more just to listen and kind of take it in. I'm also new to the district, so just trying to hear some of the perspectives. But I oversee some of the schools in this area. So like Woodstock is one that I help support. So that's kind of my role right now, just really to listen and kind of take it in. But thank you. I appreciate the concern for my voice.
I was hoping that you were from Harrison Park, because I feel like we're missing somebody from Harrison Park in our group.
To have a parent, but I think they shuffled some people around. Michelle was from Harrison Park.
So I'm wondering how much, so I know that they talked about capacity at Arleta and Woodstock as some of the why those were identified as sites for creative science, because there would be room for existing creative science students in addition to whatever that neighborhood boundary was determined to be. And I wonder how much of that, you know, there's not a lot of stomach for the optics of closing a school like Creston to take over the building for creative science. And so I think that was, and so, you know, I would love to hear more about that decision process too. And then, but it is interesting because Bridger's neighborhood community is in either one of these completely displaced anyway, like that is happening in both of these proposals at Bridger, where, you know, the Spanish one maintains an existing program. So a lot of people, I assume, come from the neighborhood in this current Spanish program, but with the Mandarin program, that is like a complete overhaul of what's currently in the building.
I'd wondered about Creston because we'd looked at their number. The building's 50% enrolled neighborhood, and so adding CSS sort of like puts them at a good enrollment, even with the even with the neighborhood draw. Whereas like I think Arleta is a much bigger building, because had we not looked at Arleta as a potential co-location for Spanish last, it was like one of the few buildings that was big enough to have 2 strands of Spanish, 2 strands of native. So that's the only reason I had.
Yeah, I think 2 strands of K8 though takes a lot more space than 2
Yeah.
strands of K5.
Yeah.
Won't be able to. Oh, sorry. Go ahead. Yep.
I've just been talking to Marissa from Harrison Park, and they are not a fan of Proposal B because of the location for their Chinese community.
Okay.
Their Chinese community has spoken out at Harrison Park about how proximity is the most important factor to them. And they don't have the time or the resources to organize and show up in these formats.
And that kind of goes to what I was about to say. I don't think we won't be able to address it, especially with our time running out in 10 seconds. But environmental impact, the traffic around Harrison Park already is murder. It's, you know, tiny little streets, tiny little roundabouts.